Commuters all over the world have a lousy time of it, there's no doubt about that. Back in the day when I too was a 9 to 5 commuter, I had a journey that added 3 hours onto my workday every single day, and I hated every minute of it. I've often thought about how some of the victims of these disasters which I talk about on the channel sometimes must have spent their last hours alive doing something utterly mundane and tedious, like commuting or queuing up to get through an airport. Today's story is a story of just that. The poor commuters on the 609 Mount Victoria rail service spent their last hours getting up before the crack of dawn in order to spend time sitting on a cramped and dirty train, completely unaware of the terrible tragedy which would shortly unfold as their train rounded the curve towards Granville railway station. The date was the 18th of January 1977, a hot midsummer's day in Sydney, Australia. For some, the summer holidays were already underway, but for many others it was business as usual. For these people, it was another regular working day, and for a few it started with a long hot commute to downtown Sydney, boarding the 609 rail commuter service, which originated some 120 kilometres to the west in the picturesque village suburb of Mount Victoria. Now, a 2.5 hour train ride through the western provinces of Sydney on a warm summer's morning certainly sounds a lot nicer than most of our daily commutes would probably be, but even the passengers on this train were not immune from the toil of the daily grind. You see, by the mid-1970s, the New South Wales rail service was hardly the envy of the world. The rail infrastructure was run down and underfunded, and management struggled to keep commuters happy with constant delays and poorly maintained, old and dirty trains. Commuters on the service from Mount Victoria often complained about the state of their train, with some even bringing on board their own cleaning products to wipe down any surface that they would touch or sit on. The carriages were wooden coach-built ones from the 1950s, old-fashioned, quaint, but uncomfortable, and the engine pulling these 8 carriages was usually an older diesel type of engine. The commuter service from Mount Victoria was given priority scheduling though, as it passed through several distant suburbs, and dispatchers were advised to shuffle trains around to try and make sure that the Mount Victoria service stayed on time, as just a 3-minute delay could end up being a 30-minute delay if a slower train got in front of it. And part of the efforts involved in prioritising the arrival of the 609 included the raising of the speed limit along a right-hand curve that led into Granville station. However, this stretch of track, even with its higher speed limit, wasn't immune from the curse of poor management and absent maintenance. Granville station is located just 10 kilometres west of downtown Sydney and serves as an interchange for several main lines running in from the south and the west. On the approach to the station from Mount Victoria, the track made a long curve which passed underneath the Bold Street Bridge. Bold Street Bridge was a pretty unremarkable bridge as bridges go. It was just a nondescript functional road overpass which ran above the railway line. I haven't even been able to find any pictures of the original bridge as it stood in 1977, as it was so completely ordinary it seems that no one ever felt the need to take a photograph of it. However, it's worth noting a couple of things that came into play on that fateful January day. First off, the original Bold Street Bridge was supported from the underneath by stanchions, load-bearing pillars which took the weight of the roadway as it passed ahead. And the second thing to note is that the roadway of the Bold Street Bridge was unusually heavy. Apparently, when construction of the original bridge was nearing completion, it was noticed that the bridge was too low to join up with the roads on each side. Somehow, that ended up being about a metre off. Seeing as the bridge span wasn't very wide and it was supported from below by stanchions, the decision was taken to add concrete to make up this missing height. This resulted in the roadway surface of Bold Street Bridge being 3 times heavier than originally envisaged, clocking in at a whopping 570 metric tons. I suppose the engineers figured everything would be fine as long as those supporting stanchions were always there to hold the bridge up. It must have never occurred to them that in a worst case scenario these supports could be removed, for instance, if a packed commuter train were to run into them. And so, on January the 18th, 1977, as the 609 service approached Granville station at 8:10 in the morning, all those years of chronic underfunding and poor track maintenance reached a critical point. Packed with 490 passengers and travelling at around 75 kilometres an hour, as the 609 rounded the curve just before the Bold Street Bridge, driver Ted Olenschwitz heard a loud crack and felt the left wheel come off the track. He threw the emergency brake, but it was already too late. Instead of following the curve, the train jumped the tracks and ploughed on straight ahead. The heavy locomotive smashed into the northern support column of the Bold Street Bridge, tearing away most of the bridge stanchions before ploughing on up the track, ripping through a metal pylon as it went. The top half of this metal pylon, still supported by the power lines, was left hanging in midair like some sort of giant jagged blade, and this blade tore into the first passenger car which had been dragged behind the engine. The ragged metal girder split the roof and side of the passenger car wide open like a can opener ripping through a tin of sardines. 8 passengers were killed instantly, and dozens more were injured in this car. Now, the passengers in car 2 were the lucky ones, as it missed the hanging metal girder and instead ran into the retaining wall of the cutting, having passed safely under Bold Street Bridge. There were obviously some injuries, but most passengers in car 2 were left unscathed. The rest of the train, passenger cars 3 to 8, had become uncoupled from the front part of the train, and they'd remained more or less upright on the tracks. These cars rolled to a halt to the front part underneath Bold Street Bridge. It looked like they'd dodged a bullet. There must have been a few moments of confusion and panic as the passengers struggled to understand what had happened to the rest of the train, but as the dust settled, panic and confusion gave way to a sense of relief that they'd seemingly emerged from this accident without a scratch. However, as the passengers began to gather their belongings and climb down from the train, the weakened Bold Street overpass collapsed, and 570 tons of steel and concrete crashed down onto the flimsy wooden passenger cars below. The damage and the destruction was instantaneous. The rear half of Carriage 3 and the front of Carriage 4 were crushed almost flat to the ground. Most passengers seated in these areas were killed instantly, as the train carriages were crushed down to as little as 20 centimetres in height. Motorbike commuter Alan Moore was riding across the Bold Street Bridge when it went down. It snapped in the middle and the two sides went down in a big V shape. It made a lot of noise. The brick ramparts in the side of the road were crumbling, and large chunks of masonry were rolling around in front of me. I saw that there was a train sticking out of either side of the bridge. People were starting to get off the train. I was in a mild state of shock, and it didn't occur to me that there would be people on the train under the bridge. But there were indeed people still alive, trapped on that train, and for them, their problems were only just beginning. For the rescue crews, nothing about this accident was easy. Initial access was difficult as the scene of the crash was down in the cutting. First responders were unable to safely reach the train, and they had to wait until ladders and ramps arrived. Once down, there was precious little that anyone could do to free the trapped survivors. The massive slab of roadway which had crushed the train had fallen more or less in one section, and it would be impossible to move without a very big crane. The electrical wires which spanned the tracks had to be cut and pulled away to allow temporary stairways to be erected. Even when firemen arrived with cutting gear, they were reluctant to use it, as the carriages carried LPG canisters for winter heating. Some of these canisters had ruptured, and the smell of the flammable gas permeated the harrowing scene. To add to the already complicated rescue effort, as news of the disaster spread, crowds of curious onlookers arrived, blocking the roads around the crash site and getting in the way of the emergency vehicles which were trying to ferry people to nearby hospitals. Some 250 policemen were eventually deployed just to control the crowd, which by mid-morning had numbered around 5,000 ghoulish sightseers. The rescue effort crawled along, and it was painfully slow going. The heat of the day was stifling, and the fire brigade had to spray water onto the crash site to try and cool down the baking concrete slabs. and these giant slabs of concrete, they kept on shifting and settling. One policeman was nearly crushed as he attempted to reach a trapped survivor, and 2 other firemen were temporarily trapped themselves under the edge of the slab when it suddenly fell down a further 15 centimetres. Rescue workers milled around on the tracks, waiting anxiously for the moment when they were able to help. At the appearance of a lone survivor being extracted from the wreckage, they ran forwards, leading to almost farcical scenes of up to 30 rescue workers jostling to carry a single stretcher. For those trapped deep within the wreckage yet somehow still alive, it would be hours before they would be freed, and sadly for many this was to be a short-lived respite. First responders were shocked when, after hours of cutting and digging out the trapped victims, these poor souls suddenly died after being freed from the tangled wreckage. This was a result of what's known as bywater syndrome or crush syndrome. In these cases, the victim, pinned beneath a heavy object, has suffered large amounts of tissue damage. Within this compressed, damaged muscle tissue, toxic amounts of myoglobin and potassium can accumulate, but it doesn't affect the victim as long as the crushing weight of whatever they are trapped under acts like a tourniquet and keeps the deadly toxins away from the organs. While ever the victim is pinned under pressure, they're still alive, but once the pressure is released and the victim is freed, the toxins circulate and quickly overwhelm the organs. It's usually the kidneys that fail and the victim dies, sometimes within seconds of being freed. At the time, this phenomenon wasn't widely understood, and the rescue workers, obviously eager to recover as many trapped passengers as possible, unwittingly sped some of them to their demise. It took over 30 hours to clear the crushed train of all survivors and bodies. A crane capable of lifting portions of the slab had been found, and eventually the flattened train was revealed. Reporter Malcolm Brown, who was there, stated that police and rescue officials watching reeled back in unison as the crushed bodies came into view. The final death toll of 84 made the Granville disaster by far and away Australia's deadliest rail accident. There were over 200 people injured, but fortunately most of these injuries were mild. Many in the rearmost carriages suffered no injuries whatsoever, and they were able to climb down from the train unaided and get on with the rest of their day. When trying to understand the root cause of the crash, attention first turned to the driver, Ted Ollenschwitz, but it became apparent that he wasn't to blame. He hadn't been speeding, and going too fast was not the reason for the derailment. When investigators checked the track, they found the cause. It hadn't been secured correctly, and none of the maintenance crews had spotted this shoddy work. The improperly fastened rails had spread out over time, which allowed the front wheel of the engine to slip off the track. The front wheel flanges of the train were also found to be very worn and should have been replaced. Now, this had been apparently spotted some 6 months earlier, but nothing had been done. It also came to light that there had already been 2 derailments on that same stretch of track, and at least in one of these derailments, one involving a freight train, cars had come off the track and struck the bridge supports. The inquiry painted a picture of neglect and shoddy maintenance that plagued the entire New South Wales rail system, with blame for this state of affairs reaching the highest levels of management. Nonetheless, no criminal charges were filed and nobody was held accountable. In the months following the Granville disaster, the Australian government promised a $200 million overhaul of the entire rail network. Today, there is a memorial garden to the victims of the crash located close to the scene of the accident.